Hola. Thank you so much for participating and helping me out with this project. The first step is for us to kind of take a look and see how we feel personally about our executive functioning skills. Executive functioning is just a really fancy way of saying like how we stay organized, our time management skills, our listening skills, and being able to like follow multiple step directions, complete tasks, things like that. So we're going to take this survey, which is going to be a starting point for us. From there, we're going to figure out maybe what our next steps will be, what kind of extra supports we might need, depending on how we score ourselves. So first, put in your last and your first name. And then there's going to be a series of different sections. Within each section, you're going to rate these statements of how you feel, how true these statements are for you personally. So if you don't feel like you ever experience whatever the statement is, then you're going to put a 0 for never. If you feel like every once in a while, maybe this is true, then put a 2 for occasionally, like maybe just here and there you've experienced it. Put a 3 for often, so a good portion of the time, but not always. And put a 4 for if it's pretty much a daily thing or it definitely impacts your life, something that you're always dealing with. Muy bien. So the first one, it is hard for me to keep my stuff organized. 0 never, 2 occasionally, 3 often, 4 usually. It is hard for me to prioritize my assignments and activities. Never, occasionally, often, usually. It is hard for me to get started on tasks that are difficult or take a while to complete. Never, occasionally, often, usually. It is hard for me to get started on tasks I'm not interested in. Never, occasionally, often, usually. It is hard for me to stop doing one thing when I need to get going on something else. Never, occasionally, often, usually. Breathe, one section over, moving on to the next. Same. We want to rate ourselves on how true each statement is. So 0 is never, like it never happens, or maybe it's only happened once or twice, but nothing significant that you can even remember. 2 is occasionally, so every once in a while, yes, you've noticed it. 3 often, so it does happen here and there. 4 usually, that's pretty much almost like an everyday occurrence. It's happening a lot and impacting your life. You're always noticing it. So it is hard for me to pay attention during lectures or discussions. Never, occasionally, often, usually. It is hard for me to follow complex directions or lots of steps to complete a task. Never, occasionally, often, usually. It is hard for me to pay attention to what I'm reading for school. Never, occasionally, often, usually. It is hard for me to do work when there is noise or others are talking. Never, occasionally, often, usually. It is hard for me to stop thinking about things that distract me from my work. Never, occasionally, often, usually. All right, another deep breath. On to the next section. Effort, still the same rating scale. So never, occasionally, often, usually, based on how you feel how true these statements are for yourself. It is hard for me to continue working even when things get difficult or confusing. Never, occasionally, often, usually. It is hard for me to stay awake and focused in class or when doing homework. Never, occasionally, often, usually. It is hard for me to work fast to complete a timed task or to slow down and be careful. Never, occasionally, often, usually. It is hard for me to make sure I complete all the steps required for a task. Never, occasionally, often, usually. It is hard for me to stay motivated to do things I'm not interested in but must do. Never, occasionally, often, usually. Another deep breath, moving on to the fifth section, emotions. Same rating scale based on how you feel these statements apply to you. I often feel disorganized. Never, occasionally, often, usually. I often feel frustrated with myself or others. Never, occasionally, often, usually. I often feel angry at myself or others. Never, occasionally, often, usually. I often feel sad. Never, occasionally, often, usually. I often feel overwhelmed with too many things to think about and do. Never, occasionally, often, usually. One more deep breath and moving on. Section 6. Memory, same scale based on how you feel these statements apply specifically to you. I have trouble remembering things I am supposed to do. Never, occasionally, often, usually. I have trouble remembering to bring things I need for school or other activities. Never, occasionally, often, usually. I have trouble remembering information I have learned. Never, occasionally, often, usually. I have trouble remembering what steps to follow for tasks. Never, occasionally, often, usually. I have trouble remembering words. Never, occasionally, often, usually. One more deep breath. Moving on to the next section. Action. Just like the others, you're rating this on how you feel each statement reflects the truth about your actions. I have difficulty checking my work to make sure it is correct and complete. Never, occasionally, often, usually. I have difficulty finishing tasks. Never, occasionally, often, usually. I have difficulty turning in my homework or classwork. Never, occasionally, often, usually. I have difficulty figuring out another way to do something if my way doesn't work. Never, occasionally, often, usually. I have difficulty keeping my things neat and organized. Never, occasionally, often, usually. Last deep breath. We are done. I know this was a lot of questions, a lot to think about, but again, it's going to be a great starting point for us to take a look at our executive functioning skills. So our organization skills, our working memory, so remembering things, following tasks, things like that, our time management skills. And then from there, we will figure out what our next steps will be, what kind of extra supports that we will put in place. And we'll take a look back actually at this exact same survey a couple different times while we're working together. So gracias.